Taehyung walked into the podcast studio with the relaxed confidence of someone who had been in front of cameras for a decade. His honey-brown hair framed his face softly under the glare of studio lighting engineered to erase shadows. The set was minimalistic, decorated with modern walnut panels and a circular table that usually served as the stage for playful banter and viral sound bites. Tonight, it would hold something heavier. The host, a well-known entertainment personality famous for turning interviews into emotional pressure chambers, leaned forward with the kind of grin that suggested he expected drama but never devastation. He delivered the question like a cue, practiced, precise, and polished. "So T fans are dying to know," he said, eyes sparkling with curiosity that had worked on 1,000 guests before. "Do you ever think about your future wife? Who she might be?" The air tightened instantly. Not the theatrical tightening that editors cut into trailers, but the kind that makes the people behind the cameras glance at each other with concern instead of anticipation. Taehyung's expression didn't shift at first. He didn't blink dramatically or inhale sharply like idols trained to perform surprise. His face stayed composed, serene even, as if the question was sliding harmlessly off glass. But his hands betrayed a different story. His fingers drifted toward a water bottle sitting on the table, droplets forming on its surface from the studio's unforgiving warmth. He touched the cap, brushed it lightly, and paused there. He wanted to open it. He needed the motion, the distraction, something to ground himself with, but he couldn't bring himself to twist it. His knuckles paled slightly under the heat of lights that suddenly felt accusatory instead of illuminating. Jungkook, watching live from the green room, shifted in his seat, the cup of coffee forgotten in his hands. He had seen Taehyung quiet before. He had seen him thoughtful, poetic, or withdrawn. But he had never seen quiet look like this, like a world folding inward, collapsing into a singular point of pain. The silence in the studio was pristine, soundproofed, engineered for clarity, and that clarity made Taehyung's whisper all the more devastating when it finally came. "She's gone," he said quietly, voice splintering with a rawness that startled even the microphones. "And she's never coming back." It wasn't delivered like a monologue or a moment designed to bait sympathy. It was an accidental rupture, the kind of honesty that arrives years too late and carries the weight of every conversation that never happened. The host froze mid-smile. His lips parted slightly, unsure if this was the moment to call for a pause or brace for a scandal. "Oh my God," he muttered, voice stripped of charm, washed instantly in sincerity. "I'm so sorry." Apology came faster than logic, but logic was already irrelevant. A tear escaped Taehyung's eye, slipping down his cheek slowly, warm against skin that suddenly looked carved from heartbreak instead of marble. The live counter climbed past 140,000 viewers, but it felt like the number had stopped mattering entirely. The internet reacted in combustion rather than chaos. Within minutes, hashtags carried his name across platforms like wildfire carried by wind. Tweets crossed 1.9 million, fans becoming archivists, detectives, psychologists, dissecting posture and tone, trying to decode a pain that wasn't coded at all. They weren't analyzing a performance. They were analyzing a man finally breaking under a question that wasn't supposed to hurt. Taehyung finally opened the water bottle. The motion was small, unceremonious, but seismic in its own way. He twisted the cap slowly, not because he wanted hydration, but because he needed punctuation. He took a sip, throat thick, eyes lifting toward the camera lens for the first time since the tear fell. The look that followed was steady, wounded, lucid, unforgettable. The world thought the question was about a future wife. The truth was that the question had teeth. Taehyung had already been bitten by 3 years earlier. The rest of the world didn't know the story yet, but tonight was the first crack. And Taehyung, for the first time in years, wasn't reaching for metaphors. He was reaching for truth. The internet never waits for context, and Taehyung knew that better than anyone. When the cameras kept rolling after his tear fell, the world outside the studio had already decided the narrative was real, raw, and irreversible. But inside, there was still disbelief suspended in the air like a breath no one wanted to take. The host had apologized. The audio engineer had frozen, but Taehyung's chest was still tightening, not from the question anymore, but from the echo it left behind. Jungkook was still watching from the green room, standing now, jaw locked, trying to reconcile the calm, poetic man he knew with the whisper that just cracked through global airwaves. Taehyung set the bottle down gently. He didn't speak immediately. He rarely did when emotions ran deeper than language. Instead, his eyes drifted toward the producer behind the glass wall, whose face looked like someone had just rewritten the script of the entire night without warning. A signal to cut the feed was raised halfway before being lowered again. They were all trapped in uncertainty. Was this a moment, a meltdown, a headline in the making? Taehyung finally broke the silence, but not the way idols were expected to. "If fans want truth," he said, voice rough like sand dragged by tide, "then they need to understand that truth isn't always pretty." His words were calm now, but calm didn't mean healed. Calm meant acceptance of the storm. The host swallowed hard, leaning back slightly, like someone stepping away from a bonfire they accidentally lit. "We can reschedule," he offered quietly, voice unsteady for the first time that night. "No," Taehyung replied, shaking his head faintly. "Rescheduling is what I've been doing for years." The sentence carried history, the kind of history that fandoms don't see in behind-the-scenes compilations or DVD extras. This was personal, long avoided, quietly lived, and suddenly exposed not by tabloids, but by a question no one predicted would pierce armor forged by fame. In the green room, Jungkook exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. He remembered a night eerily similar, not in public, not in front of viewers, but in a Tokyo hotel suite where rain drowned neon reflections in puddles on pavement. A voicemail played accidentally through speakers. Taehyung's voice softer then, scared, wounded, apologizing to someone whose name he never said out loud. Jungkook hadn't meant to hear it, but he did, and Taehyung didn't know he knew. That night ended in a slammed door and silence, stretching longer than any chorus of BTS's most painful ballads. Taehyung's voice pulled Jungkook back to the present. "The world keeps imagining a version of my life that looks like postcards and runway footage," he said, gaze fixed ahead, "but no one imagines the parts that ache quietly." He paused again, a longer pause. The studio could have cut it, but they didn't, because viewers weren't leaving. They were multiplying. Pain, vulnerability, and buried love stories always multiply attention, even when they shouldn't. "What happened?" the host asked finally, softer now, sincerity replacing provocation. "Did you lose someone?" Taehyung didn't answer immediately. Instead, he leaned back in his chair slightly, posture suddenly looking older than 30. "I didn't lose her," he said quietly. "I let her go." The difference between losing and letting go is small linguistically but catastrophic emotionally. Jungkook flinched again off camera. Letting go meant choice. Choice meant accountability. Accountability meant truth is heavier than headlines. The viewers climbed past 180,000. Comments rolled faster than human eyes could parse. Some screaming heartbreak, some accusing, some begging for explanation, some already painting the host as villain, even though Taehyung didn't need one tonight. The villain tonight was hesitation itself, and fear. Fear of choosing wrong, fear of loving too loudly, fear of betraying the brand narrative idol systems try to build around their artists. The producer finally stood, mouthing, "Cut the feed," more urgently now. But again, Taehyung waved it off gently. "I'm not done talking," he said quietly, and quietly was louder than screaming in that studio. "I stayed for the wrong reasons," he continued, eyes steady, wounded, reflective. "And I told myself it was loyalty, but it was fear dressed like loyalty." Jungkook felt the words hit like ricocheting bullets against metal. Fear dressed like loyalty. That was Taehyung. That was Jungkook. That was all of BTS at some point. They were boys who became global monuments before they became adults who understood love, boundaries, sacrifice, and truth. The host finally nodded slowly, surrendering to sincerity. "We'll take a break," he said gently, "and when you're ready, we continue." Taehyung stood quietly, the chair scraping faintly, a sound like punctuation to part one of an unraveling. "No breaks," he said again, voice quiet but unshakable. "The break already happened 3 years ago. This is aftermath." And Jungkook, standing in the green room, finally understood this wasn't about a future wife at all. This was about the cost of choices deferred too long, and the price of love left unnamed. The studio feed had ended, but Taehyung's voice had not. Even after microphones cooled and cameras dimmed into standby mode, the emotional tremor kept traveling far beyond the recording equipment. Headlines were multiplying, but this part of the story was still hidden from them, at least for now. Jungkook, who had watched every second from the green room, was packing slowly, sneakers dragging faint friction against the carpet. He wasn't panicking. Jungkook rarely panicked outwardly. He was collecting himself inwardly, like someone gathering shards of a mirror before realizing they might still cut his hands. Taehyung was escorted off-set not by security but by gravity itself. He didn't fight. He didn't resist. His body moved forward because it had no choice, but his heart stayed in the chair he had just vacated, trembling under studio heat that no longer felt like lighting but interrogation. The producer's face flashed through his peripheral vision again, mouthing urgent words Taehyung couldn't hear anymore. Urgency was useless now. The moment had already metastasized into digital immortality. In the hallway, Taehyung paused near a fire exit door that led to nothing glamorous, nothing curated, nothing brand-aligned. He leaned a hand against the metal bar, head bowed slightly, not crying anymore but processing. Crying is release. Processing is sentencing. He wasn't releasing pain now. He was reading the verdict it left behind. Jungkook stopped packing when he saw Taehyung enter the hallway through the monitor feed, still playing silently in the corner of the green room. The two of them shared history heavy enough to warp silence itself. History that tabloids would later try to translate into theories and shipping threads. But the real story was quieter, sharper, and older than fandom vocabulary had the maturity to parse. Taehyung's jacket pocket carried weight, not emotional weight, literal weight, a folded letter whose edges were soft from time spent pressed against his rib cage. He pulled it out slowly, paper whispering faint static against fabric. The letter wasn't addressed to anyone tonight. It was addressed to a version of himself he had stopped being 3 years ago. The handwriting looked like memory incarnated in ink. The kind of ink that doesn't scream, it stains. Jungkook walked into the hallway, footsteps deliberate but quiet, like someone approaching a monument that had started cracking internally. "You okay?" he asked, voice low, almost afraid to disturb Taehyung's processing state. It was a rhetorical question. The answer was obvious, but rhetorical questions sometimes serve as permission slips to keep talking without detonating more truth. Taehyung looked up slowly, eyes bloodshot but dry now. "No," he said quietly, "I'm not okay, but I'm done pretending I am." Jungkook nodded slowly, jaw tight but understanding. "Then don't pretend," he said, "but don't let them make villains out of the wrong people." "The only villain tonight," Taehyung said softly, "was fear." Jungkook exhaled slowly, nodding again. He leaned against the wall beside Taehyung, posture mirroring someone who was bracing for more than headlines. "Do you want me to call someone?" "Who?" Taehyung asked. "The woman," Jungkook replied, almost a whisper. "Or HYBE?" Taehyung shook his head faintly, then let out a small laugh. "A painful one." "Neither," he said. "This isn't about corporate statements or buried lovers. This is about me realizing I stayed in limbo long enough for limbo to become home." Jungkook blinked once, twice, then nodded again, but this time slower. "That line," he said, "limbo becoming home, you never said it out loud before, but I think all of us lived it." "Yeah," Taehyung replied softly, "but I lived it longest." They both fell quiet again, but this time it wasn't the brutal silence of aftermath. It was the mutual silence of recognition. Recognition that the unraveling had only begun, and that tonight wasn't the breakdown itself. Tonight was the door finally opening to what BTS had avoided numbing for years, the cost of loving quietly in a system that monetizes noise. The worst part of heartbreak isn't tears. It's the years spent pretending tears aren't owed, and Taehyung had just paid the first installment. Taehyung had always carried emotions the way artists carry notebooks, quietly, constantly, privately, and with the understanding that one day they might become material. The difference was that notebooks were meant to be opened. His heart had not been. Not until that podcast question cracked the vault by accident, turning personal grief into public property overnight. By the time the staff managed to dim the studio lights fully, millions of people were refreshing their screens, replaying his voice, reinterpreting his silence, and writing entire psychological profiles based on a 12-second moment that was never engineered to be dissected. Taehyung was already far from the set, but the moment was still sitting at the table like a third guest, no one invited but everyone would remember. In the hallway, Jungkook remained beside him, not offering solutions but presence, because solutions belong to the PR department and presence belonged to friendship, or maybe, in their case, something more unspoken but not unnamed anymore. They were mirrors reflecting different sides of the same pressure. One side cracked first. The other side recognized the fracture. Taehyung slid the folded letter back into his jacket slowly. The paper carried the softness of time, but the truth inside it was steel. Jungkook didn't ask to read it. He knew better than to request access to a wound someone had only just stopped hiding. Some doors are opened by questions. Some are opened by exhaustion. A staff member approached cautiously, holding a tablet glowing with trending stats, as if numbers could translate heartbreak into strategy. It's everywhere, he said gently, voice small compared to the magnitude of the digital wildfire. We need a statement soon. Taehyung glanced at the screen, not surprised, not horrified, just observant. Statements don't explain people, he said quietly. They protect companies. The staff member swallowed, unsure if he was being dismissed or enlightened. Jungkook stepped in gently. He'll talk when he's ready, he said, a protective tone that wasn't aggressive but immovable. But don't rush a headline into therapy. The staff member nodded and stepped back. He realized belatedly that this moment had no sponsor, no ROI forecast, no crisis playbook. This was humanity leaking through an industry built to package perfection. Taehyung began walking slowly toward the lounge area where the other members had unknowingly been shielded from the initial tremor. Jimin was scrolling on his phone, eyebrows knitted in confusion, seeing the explosion without having witnessed the spark. T cried, he asked aloud, stunned. About a wife question. About a life question, Jungkook corrected softly as Taehyung sat down on the couch. Namjoon looked up from a book, Yoongi from behind a cup of iced Americano, Hobi from mid-stretch, Jin from a snack tray. Their reactions were all different, but their eyes were the same, heavy with understanding before explanation even arrived. We all have a wife question, Yoongi said quietly. But not everyone has a gone answer. He said she's gone, Jimin whispered, almost reverent, like someone realizing the gravity after hearing the tremor's direction. Taehyung didn't speak for a moment. He let the silence settle, not the old silence of avoidance but the new silence of ownership. I'm okay with fans knowing I hurt, he said finally. I'm not okay with fans thinking hurt needs a timeline or a villain or a wedding to fix it. Jin nodded, reaching for a cracker. You don't owe weddings, he said gently. You owe honesty. Namjoon closed the book softly. And you just delivered it. The room exhaled collectively, realizing that the breakdown wasn't the story. The story was that Taehyung had survived 3 years of unprocessed accountability and still managed to stand long enough to tell the world that heartbreak was not a teaser for romance. It was the consequence of deferring truth. The lounge was quiet now, but it was a different kind of quiet, not the brittle silence of shock, but the dense calm that settles when everyone realizes something irreversible has already happened. Taehyung sat with his elbows resting on his knees, gaze lowered slightly, like someone listening to a song only he could hear. The members gave him space, but none of them left. BTS had mastered stadium noise, but moments like this reminded them they were also fluent in emotional stillness. Jimin broke the silence first, but gently, like tapping a glass to test its thickness instead of shattering it. The fans love you, he said softly. They don't love a fictional ending, they love you. Taehyung nodded once, slow, thoughtful. I know, he replied. That's why it hurts more, because they think they know all of me. but they only know the parts I survived out loud. Yoongi leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. Pain doesn't trend unless it shocks, he said, and love doesn't shock unless it bleeds. Taehyung finally looked up at him, eyes steady but heavy, like dusk carrying its own shade without needing night. It bled 3 years ago, he said quietly. I just didn't let anyone see the color. The producer was watching them now from across the room, not interrupting this time. He realized this was no longer a crisis to manage. It was a moment to witness. Taehyung wasn't spiraling. He was narrating his own autopsy of indecision, and doing it more coherently than any press release ever could. Hoseok sat beside him and placed a hand on his shoulder, warm and grounding. You don't have to tell them everything, he said. You just have to stop letting fear write the blank parts for you. Taehyung exhaled slowly, a breath like someone putting down a heavy instrument after a long performance. Fear already wrote most of it, he replied. I'm just done signing its name. Namjoon stood and walked toward the window, city lights smearing into long lines against the glass. Fandom wants destinations, he said, but healing is just motion without maps. And I stopped moving, Taehyung said, completing the thought, because I thought standing still would save everyone from turbulence. Turns out, it just saved me from accountability. The room felt the sentence land like piano keys struck in an empty auditorium. Not loud, but resonant enough to stay in bones. Jungkook finally sat across from him, leaning forward slightly. Do you regret her? He asked, voice sincere, unfiltered. Taehyung shook his head gently. No, he said. I regret the silence I wrapped her in. Jungkook nodded slowly, recognizing the difference. Regret of a person fades. Regret of cowardice lingers. The viewers outside were still climbing, even though the feed was down. Clips were circulating faster than context could catch them. But context would eventually arrive, because Taehyung was finally willing to tell it, not in fragments engineered for virality, but in emotional continuity. He stood slowly again, stretching his shoulders back. This isn't about a future wife, he said, voice clearer now, stronger but not healed, just owned. This is about me surviving a heartbreak I never processed publicly because the industry taught me emotions are either merchandise or liability. He paused, scanning their faces. But heartbreak isn't merchandise, it's the receipt. Jin nodded again, this time smiling faintly. Then let them see the receipt, he said gently. Just don't let them think it's an invitation to reorder your life. Taehyung laughed softly again, a little lighter this time, like someone who had stopped drowning but still respected water. Yeah, he said. No reorders, no refunds, just truth. Taehyung always knew the world would romanticize him, but he never imagined the romanticization would start from a wound. Usually, idols become mythology through triumph, visuals, mystique, or charisma. Taehyung became mythology through honesty no one was prepared for. And honesty, once spilled, behaves like water. It finds cracks you didn't know existed and refuses to be contained again. The other members were watching him carefully now, not because they expected him to collapse again, but because they realized this was the first time he was standing without a mask built from metaphors. For years, Taehyung had turned emotions into poetry, poetry into mystique, mystique into branding. Tonight, he had skipped all the conversions and spoken in raw emotional currency instead. No exchange rate, no artistic encryption, just truth paid in full with interest accrued over silence. A stylist approached quietly, holding a tissue box, unsure if the gesture was still needed. Taehyung smiled faintly, shaking his head politely. I'm not crying anymore, he said. I'm calibrating. The stylist blinked, confused at first, then nodded as she stepped back. Calibrating meant measuring damage. Crying meant feeling it. He had already felt it. Now he was reading the metrics it left in his life. Jimin finally set his phone down, turning fully toward him. You know they'll ask her name eventually, he said, and if you don't say it, they'll invent one. Taehyung nodded again, but slower this time. Let them invent, he replied. Invention keeps them busy, truth keeps them changed. Namjoon let out a small chuckle, a low sound of admiration. That's the most artist thing you've said tonight, he said. weaponizing ambiguity so honesty can breathe. Taehyung leaned back again, eyes tracing the studio's ceiling tiles. Fans think silence means mystery, he said, but silence is just grief too polite to interrupt noise. Yoongi raised an eyebrow, smirking slightly. Grief should interrupt more often, he said. It deserves airtime too. Not airtime, Taehyung corrected softly. Name time. I needed to name it even if I didn't narrate every chapter. Jungkook crossed his arms loosely, leaning against the couch now. And now, he asked. Now I live with the aftermath instead of the imagination, Taehyung said. Imagination is soft. Aftermath has corners. The producer cleared his throat faintly from across the room. Not the dramatic clearing before an announcement, but the small, polite clearing of someone trying to re-enter the conversation without sounding corporate. He said gently. If you want to continue the episode later, we can shift the angle, make it reflective instead of speculative. Taehyung shook his head again, calm now, composed not by healing but by exhaustion of avoidance. Don't shift the angle, he said. Shift the world's assumption that love is a milestone instead of a memory. The producer nodded again. He realized belatedly that Taehyung was no longer responding to questions. He was rewriting their premise. Taehyung stood again, slower than before but not fragile, just deliberate. If they want my future wife, he said, they should first learn the price of the one I didn't marry. The room went silent again, not shocked, just reverent. Because reverence is what honesty earns when it's delivered without rehearsal. And the price, Taehyung continued quietly, wasn't heartbreak. The price was years spent acting like heartbreak was optional. Jungkook nodded again, a small tight nod of recognition. Then let this be the last optional year, he said softly. Taehyung smiled faintly. It already is, he said. This is overdue payment. By the time the studio officially announced a short intermission, the internet had already built a shrine out of Taehyung's unfiltered moment. Clips looped endlessly, slow-zoom edits magnified his whisper, and reaction threads stretched longer than movie credits. But Taehyung himself was finally sitting with the one thing he had avoided longer than headlines: closure. Not closure as in an ending, but closure as in ownership of the story instead of fear of it. He walked back toward the recording set after a long conversation with the members, whose words weren't about optics or audience retention. Their words were about him staying human while being famous, not the other way around. Taehyung wasn't shaking anymore. He wasn't crying anymore. His heartbeat wasn't the one racing now. The world's assumptions were. The host stood when he saw Taehyung re-enter the studio. There was no grin this time, no theatrical lean-forward posture designed for viral tension. Instead, there was something rarer in celebrity interviews, respect that arrived before questions did. We don't have to continue if you're uncomfortable, the host offered. Taehyung shook his head gently, lips forming a small, thoughtful smile. Comfort kept me quiet for 3 years, he said. Discomfort finally made me speak. The host exhaled slowly, nodding again, realizing he had accidentally opened a door Taehyung had been leaning against from the inside for too long. Then let's do this properly, the host said, switching tone completely. Not about the fantasy, about the person. Taehyung nodded. Not the person, he corrected softly. The choice. Taehyung sat again, adjusting his mic himself this time. The movement was simple, small, practical, but the world outside would later overanalyze it like it was symbolic choreography. It wasn't choreography. It was autonomy. If you want the real story, he said, eyes fixed ahead, you have to accept that the saddest love stories aren't loud. They're quiet long enough to fool everyone, including the people living them. The host listened without interrupting, because interruptions were no longer needed. The story wasn't spilling anymore, it was being told intentionally now. I thought loving quietly was noble, Taehyung continued. I thought protecting her name, protecting the group, protecting the narrative was the same as protecting the truth. But protection without honesty is just postponement disguised as sacrifice. Jungkook, now seated silently in the observation room, watched without packing, without coffee, without friction, just recognition. Because recognition is the moment you realize the pain you witnessed wasn't a glitch. It was a ledger finally being read. "The apology you gave me," the host said gently, "was faster than I deserved." "No," Taehyung replied. "You apologized for the spark. I'm apologizing for the years before the spark." The sentence landed with a quiet force that microphones weren't built to dramatize but were forced to capture anyway. Taehyung leaned back again, but this time not to distance himself, just to breathe. "Fans want weddings," he said. "They want timelines, dates, faces, ceremonies, and futures wrapped in ribbon. But no one asks what happens when you freeze in the middle of love because you think motion will hurt someone else." He paused, eyes lowering slightly again, but voice steady now. "You don't avoid heartbreak by freezing. You just delay the honesty that should have arrived before the heartbreak." The studio didn't feel like an interview anymore. It felt like a confession that didn't ask forgiveness, only understanding. Understanding that truth delayed doesn't soften impact, it sharpens it. The episode wasn't about his future wife anymore. It was about the moment Taehyung finally realized that grief deserved a name, even if love never got a ceremony. And the world, for once, wasn't just watching a story. They were watching a man stop running from the premise of the story itself. And that was the part that would last longer than tears, longer than clips, longer than hashtags. The moment ownership replaced fear as Taehyung's loudest legacy. The studio lights were back at full brightness, but Taehyung's expression was no longer flinching away from them. The world outside might have assumed he returned to the set to repair the moment, soften the blow, or rewrite the headline, but Taehyung didn't come back to correct anything. He came back to confirm it. Not the heartbreak itself, but the fact that heartbreak had never been optional and avoidance had never been protection. The host adjusted his posture again, slower this time, like someone who finally understood the rhythm of a conversation that didn't require theatrics to hold an audience. "You said you let her go," the host repeated gently, voice lowered in a tone that sounded less like a question and more like an attempt to understand the anatomy of a sentence that had shaken millions. "Do you think you did the right thing?" Taehyung inhaled, not sharply, not dramatically, just thoughtfully, like someone choosing which truth deserved to be spoken first. "The right thing is a luxury phrase," he said softly, "used by people who get enough time to decide before life decides for them." The host didn't interrupt, because interruptions belong to the era before sincerity arrived. "I didn't get that luxury," Taehyung continued, gaze steady, voice calmer but not lighter. "I was making choices for a global brand before I was making choices for myself. And brands don't marry, people do." Jungkook, watching again silently from the observation room, nodded faintly, recognizing the shape of the truth without needing to occupy the sentence with his own. Taehyung let his eyes drift briefly toward the microphone cable snaking across the table, looping like a metaphor for the years he had spent circling decisions without letting any of them land. "Letting her go wasn't strategic," he said quietly. "It wasn't noble. It wasn't tragic for drama's sake. It was a consequence of a life I never paused long enough to edit internally." The host leaned back slowly, letting out a breath that sounded like belated empathy instead of anticipation. "Fans will still ship you into a wedding," he said gently. "They always want a destination." "Let them," Taehyung replied with a small, sad smile. "Destinations are for people who think love is a train. Love is weather. You don't board it, you survive it, or you shelter from it until shelter becomes suffocation." The producer outside the glass wall lowered his tablet again. Numbers were still climbing. Comments were still racing. But Taehyung wasn't performing anymore. He was translating a heartbreak that had been stored in silence into language no editor could dramatize further. "I used to think interviews were landmines," Taehyung said softly. "But interviews are just mirrors with microphones. The landmine was already in me. The question just stepped on it." Jungkook exhaled again, slower now, recognition turning into acceptance. The host finally nodded, eyes glistening faintly, not stealing the emotional spotlight but reflecting it properly this time. "Then what do you want fans to take from this?" Taehyung didn't rush. Rushing belonged to fantasy narratives. He spoke slowly, deliberately, calmly, but with the sharpness of someone who had stopped negotiating with fear. "I want them to stop asking me who I'll marry," he said, "and start asking why I froze when I still had someone to love." The host's eyebrows rose slightly, stunned at the emotional precision of a sentence that didn't need embellishment to stay viral. "Because that's the part that matters," Taehyung continued. "Not the wedding they imagine, the truth I avoided." The world outside would later claim this episode broke the mold of celebrity interviews. The truth was simpler. Taehyung hadn't broken the mold. He had stepped out of it quietly and refused to re-enter. And for the first time that night, the studio lights didn't feel like interrogation anymore. They felt like witnesses.